Close your eyes for a moment. Let the hum of the modern world fade to silence. Feel yourself slipping backward through time, through centuries of accumulated history, through layers of civilization built one atop another. You're traveling to a place that exists now only in ruins and whispers, yet once stood as the greatest empire the world had ever known. It's the 2nd century of the Common Era. The year might be 117, when the empire stretched to its absolute furthest reach under Emperor Trajan. Or perhaps it's 138, during the reign of Hadrian, when the frontiers were consolidated and great walls rose at the edges of the known world. Maybe it's somewhere in between, in that remarkable period historians would later call the height of Roman civilization, when 5 good emperors ruled in succession, and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, settled like morning dew across 3 continents. From the drizzle-soaked hills of Britain to the sun-baked plains of North Africa, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the banks of the Euphrates River in the east, Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman ambition bound together a territory of over 5 million square kilometers. Within that vast expanse lived somewhere between 55 and 100 million people, depending on which scholar you ask. It was the most populous, unified political entity the Western world would see until the modern age. But you're not traveling to meet emperors or senators. You're not going to recline at aristocratic banquets or debate philosophy in marble halls. Tonight, you're descending into the life of someone ordinary, someone whose name history never bothered to record, someone who woke each morning not to the luxury of an atrium villa, but to the creaking wood and crumbling plaster of an insula, those towering apartment buildings that housed Rome's masses. You're becoming one of the plebeians, the common people, the working class who formed the backbone of this magnificent empire. Or perhaps you're even lower than that, one of the countless enslaved people who did the empire's hardest labor while possessing none of its rights. Either way, you're about to experience a day that would have been utterly ordinary in Rome, yet extraordinary in its challenges and its humanity. The city of Rome itself, at the empire's height, was home to perhaps 1 million people. Imagine that for a moment. 1 million souls crammed into a space of ancient streets and valleys between 7 hills. It was the New York, the London, the Tokyo of its time, a metropolis unlike anything else in the ancient world. Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria came close, but Rome was the beating heart, the center from which all roads famously led, and to which all roads returned. And what a heart it was. Grand temples rose toward the sky, their columns gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun. The Colosseum, though we wouldn't call it that yet, the Flavian amphitheater, stood as a monument to engineering and spectacle, capable of seating 50,000 people. Aqueducts marched across the countryside on their precise stone arches, carrying millions of gallons of fresh water each day into the city. Public baths, some large enough to accommodate thousands at once, offered spaces of marble luxury and communal ritual. But that was the Rome of monuments, the Rome that tourists and emperors saw. The Rome you're about to inhabit lived in the shadows of those monuments, in the narrow streets where sunlight rarely reached the lower floors, where the smell of cooking food mingled with less pleasant odors. where the noise never quite stopped, and sleep came as much from exhaustion as from comfort. Let's be clear about what we mean by regular people, because Rome's society was anything but simple. At the very top sat the emperor, surrounded by senators and the old patrician families who could trace their lineages back to Rome's founding myths. Below them came the equestrians, wealthy businessmen and minor nobility. Then came the plebeians, free-born Roman citizens who might be anything from modestly successful merchants to labourers barely scraping by. Some plebeians owned their own shops or workshops. Others worked for wages when they could find work. Still, others depended on the grain dole, that monthly distribution of wheat that kept Rome's poor from starvation and revolution. And below even the poorest citizen came the slaves. Perhaps 30% of Rome's population lived in bondage, their status determined not by race or ethnicity, the way later slaveries would function, but by the accidents of war, debt, or birth. A slave might be a barbarian captured on the frontiers, a Greek intellectual working as a tutor, a debt servant from Italia itself, or a child born to enslaved parents. Their experiences varied wildly. Some household slaves lived more comfortably than free labourers. Some skilled slaves saved enough money to buy their freedom, becoming freedmen with certain rights. But many others toiled in mines, on agricultural estates, or in the worst urban conditions imaginable, with no hope of escape. For the purposes of this journey, you are neither wealthy nor enslaved, though you'll see both conditions up close. You're a free-born plebeian, probably urban, probably living in one of those insulae we mentioned. You might be a shopkeeper, a labourer, a street vendor, someone in a skilled trade if you're lucky. You're not starving most days, but you're always aware that disaster is maybe just one illness, one accident, one bad season away. The air smells different here. Wood smoke from countless cooking fires, human waste from streets and alleys where the drainage never quite worked as planned, garlic and onions from market stalls, olive oil, sweat, perfume from a passing aristocrat's litter, the earthy smell of animals being led to slaughter. It's not all unpleasant, this olfactory symphony. There's fresh bread from bakeries, herbs drying in the sun, the clean scent of fresh water, splashing from public fountains, incense from household shrines and public temples. The sounds are equally layered. Vendors crying their wares in that particular sing-song rhythm that merchants have used since humans first learned to trade. Carts rumbling over stone-paved streets, though only at night, as wheeled traffic is banned during daylight hours in the city centre. Children playing their timeless games, their laughter ringing off close-packed walls. Someone practicing a musical instrument, probably badly. A distant roar from the amphitheatre on a festival day. The splash and echo of fountains. Arguments, always arguments, in a dozen languages from across the empire. And underneath it all, like a bass note that never stops, the sound of a million people simply living, breathing, talking, eating, moving through their days. Now feel the weight of your tunic, the simple woolen garment that most Romans wear. Feel the rough fabric against your skin, patched in a few places, stained in others, smelling faintly of your body and the cheap oil you used last time you went to the baths. On your feet, if you're fortunate, are sandals, the leather cracked and worn. If you're less fortunate, your feet are bare, calloused from walking on rough streets. You're standing in one of Rome's many neighborhoods, the densely packed areas where the working people live. The street is narrow enough that you could almost touch the buildings on both sides if you spread your arms. Above you, insulae rise 5, 6, sometimes even 7 stories high, despite laws limiting their height. They lean slightly, almost imperceptibly, these buildings, as if tired from holding up their own weight and all the lives within them. It's late afternoon in the 2nd century, in the greatest city of the greatest empire the world has yet seen. And you need to get home before dark, because home, as humble and crowded as it is, represents the small circle of safety in a city that's magnificent, dangerous, exhausting, and endlessly alive. The sun is dropping toward the western hills, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Shadows are lengthening across the narrow streets. You feel that familiar tug of exhaustion from a day's labor, whatever form that labor took. Your feet hurt. Your back aches. Your stomach reminds you that the midday meal was small and the evening meal is still to come. But for now, let's walk together through what a day in your life would actually look like. From the moment you wake on your thin mat to the moment you close your eyes again at night, we'll trace the rhythms of ordinary life in extraordinary times. And perhaps, in understanding how these regular people lived, how they worked and worried, and found small joys in difficult circumstances, we'll understand something deeper about what it means to be human in any age. Because while the emperors and their deeds fill the history books, it was people like you, millions of people whose names we'll never know, who actually made the empire function, who built the roads and baked the bread and carried the water and raised the children who would do it all again. So, let this be your permission to rest, to slip into a time so foreign it might as well be another planet, yet so familiar in its human concerns that you'll recognize yourself in every struggle and small victory. The Roman Empire awaits, and so does sleep. The first thing you notice when consciousness returns is not light, but sound. Somewhere above you, on the floor that's structurally questionable at best, someone is already awake and moving. Their footsteps creak across wooden boards that protest with each step. A door slams. Someone shouts, the words muffled but the irritation crystal clear. Then comes the baby, crying, inevitable as sunrise, from the apartment next to yours. The walls in an insula are thin, so thin that you know your neighbors' lives almost as intimately as your own. You know when they fight, when they make love, when they're sick, when they're celebrating. Privacy is a luxury for the rich, housed in their domus with rooms that have actual doors and walls thick enough to contain secrets. You open your eyes to dimness. Your apartment, if we can dignify it with that word, occupies a corner of the 4th floor. It's a single room, roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, shared with your spouse and 2 children. Or perhaps you share it with siblings and a parent. Or perhaps you're a freedman living alone. Your only possessions a sleeping mat, a few cooking implements, and the tools of whatever trade keeps you alive. The walls are plaster over brick, painted once in a reddish ochre that's now faded and peeling. There's a small window, unglazed, that lets in some light and a lot of weather. In winter, You'll stuff it with rags or wood planks to keep out the cold. In summer, you'll be grateful for any breeze. Right now, in this eternal afternoon of imagination, the light filtering through is soft and dusty, catching motes that dance in the air like tiny spirits. Your sleeping mat is a simple affair, straw and old fabric on a wooden frame that stands only slightly off the floor. The blanket that covered you is wool, rough against the skin, and it carries the smell of human sleep, that particular mustiness that comes from bodies that don't get washed as often as they might. Romans value cleanliness. They love their baths, but daily full-body bathing isn't always possible when the nearest bathhouse costs money you might not have, and when exhaustion from labor makes even that small journey feel insurmountable. You sit up slowly, feeling your spine crack and protest. You're not old, maybe 27, 30 at most, but your body already carries the accumulated damage of hard living. Most Romans don't live to see 50. Life expectancy at birth hovers somewhere around 25 to 30 years, though that statistic is brutal because it includes infant mortality, which is catastrophic. Maybe 1 in 3 babies doesn't survive the first year. Maybe more. If you make it past childhood, your odds improve, but not by enough to be comforting. The room is warming up slightly as dawn progresses. In summer, these upper floors become ovens, the heat rising and concentrating until sleep is nearly impossible and people take to the roofs or streets for relief. In winter, they're freezing, the small brazier that provides your only heat, never quite adequate, always threatening to tip over and start a fire that could consume the entire block within an hour. Fire is the great terror of insular life. These buildings are built cheap and built fast, wood and plaster, and corners cut at every opportunity. The landlord, whom you've never met, lives somewhere else, probably in a nice house in a better neighborhood. He employs an agent, usually a freedman, to collect rent and make the bare minimum of repairs. That agent will squeeze every copper coin he can from the tenants, while spending as little as possible on maintenance. The stairs, when you use them later, will be narrow and dark, the wood worn smooth in the centers where countless feet have trod. The higher you live, the cheaper the rent, but also the more dangerous. If there's a fire below, you're trapped. If the building collapses, something that happens with distressing regularity, you're buried. In the winter of the year 122, during Hadrian's reign, the emperor will actually pass laws limiting building height to 60 feet. But landlords will continue to evade and ignore these restrictions, piling story upon illegal story because housing demand far exceeds supply. You share your space with rats. They're not pets, obviously, but they're constant companions, scurrying in the walls, bold enough to venture out when food is left unprotected. Sometimes at night, you feel them run across your blanket, and you've learned to slap at them reflexively without fully waking. They carry fleas, the rats and the fleas carrying diseases that will go unnamed and unexplained for another 1,000 years or more. The floor beneath you is packed earth, or if you're slightly better off, rough wooden boards. There's no furniture to speak of. A small shelf holds a few clay vessels, some cooking implements, perhaps a small oil lamp. In the corner stands a large ceramic vessel, an amphora that held wine or olive oil when it was new, but now serves as storage for your food stores, assuming you have any. Next to it, less pleasantly, is the chamber pot, a ceramic vessel that will need to be emptied today. Its contents either dumped into the street through your window, or, if you're conscientious and have the energy, carried down to the nearest public latrine. The Roman toilet, when we get to it, deserves its own moment of attention. But for now, just know that most insula dwellers don't have access to any plumbing. No running water in your room, no toilet, no sink. Everything must be carried in or carried out. Water comes from public fountains, and you'll need to make that trip carrying your heavy clay jug at least once today. Waste goes out the window or into the pot, and people are supposed to shout a warning, "Cave" or "Watch out" before dumping. But not everyone bothers, and walking Roman streets requires a certain awareness of what might be falling from above. You hear your family stirring now. Your spouse groans softly, experiencing their own unwelcome return to consciousness. One child whimpers, then falls back to sleep. The other, older by a few years, is already sitting up, rubbing eyes crusted with sleep. In the gradually strengthening light, you can see the gaunt thinness of the child's arms, the slightly distended belly that speaks of malnutrition, diet that's heavy on grain and lacking in almost everything else. But the child is alive, which is more than can be said for the first baby, the one who died at 3 months from some illness that came on suddenly and couldn't be fought off. You don't talk about that loss, but you think about it every day. From the apartment below comes the smell of cooking. Someone starting a fire in their brazier, preparing whatever serves as breakfast. The smell is mostly smoke at first, then gradually shifts to something more enticing, maybe bread toasting or gruel heating. Your own stomach responds with a gurgle of interest. Outside, through your small window, you can hear the city coming to life. Rome doesn't really sleep, not truly. There's always activity, always sound. But the quality of the noise changes at dawn. The drunks and the night workers give way to the early risers, to the bakers who've been working since the middle of the night, to the vendors setting up their stalls, to the slaves being sent on the first errands of the day. A rooster crows, though you're in the heart of the city. Someone nearby keeps chickens, probably illegally, but also probably tolerated because fresh eggs are precious, and the urban poor need every advantage they can get. Dogs bark, starting their daily chorus. A door slams somewhere, followed by angry shouting in what might be Greek or perhaps Aramaic. Rome is polyglot, a true melting pot of languages and cultures from across the empire and beyond. You rise to your feet, feeling your joints protest. The movement disturbs a small beetle that was traversing your sleeping mat. It scuttles away into a crack in the wall, where it will live out its brief life among plaster dust and other beetles, a miniature tenant in this tenement of flesh and wood. Your tunic, the one you wore yesterday and will wear again today because it's the only one you have, lies crumpled nearby. You pull it over your head, feeling the rough wool settle across your shoulders. There's no mirror, so you don't know how you look, though you can guess. Hair that needs cutting, face that needs shaving, skin that needs washing. These will all wait until you can afford the time and the few coins to visit the baths, maybe. Today, if work goes well, maybe tomorrow. Before anything else, though, there's a ritual to observe. In the corner of your room, mounted on the wall at eye level, is a small household shrine, a lararium. It's nothing fancy, just a painted niche with a tiny shelf. On that shelf sit small clay figurines, no bigger than your thumb. These represent the lares, the household gods who protect your home and family, and the penates, who watch over your stored food and your sustenance. You've already lost one child. You live in a building that could burn down or collapse at any moment. Disease moves through crowded neighborhoods like wind through wheat. You have no insurance, no safety net, no emergency room to visit when crisis strikes. The gods, nebulous and fickle as they might be, are the only protection you've got. So you pause in front of the shrine and you offer a brief prayer. There's no food to sacrifice this morning. Your stores are too low. But you make a gesture of devotion, perhaps touching your fingers to your lips and then to the figurines. You ask for safety, for health, for enough work to earn enough money to buy enough food. You ask that the building doesn't collapse today, that your children stay healthy, that your spouse finds work if they're seeking it. The prayer is quick, muttered half under your breath. You're not sure the gods are even listening. Philosophers debate divine intervention. Priests insist on cosmic attention to human affairs. But in your experience, bad things happen regardless of piety. Still, not praying seems like tempting fate, so you hedge your bets with a few words and a touch of respect. Your spouse is up now, moving around the tiny space with practiced efficiency. There's a morning routine, choreographed by necessity into the most economical movements. One person tends the small cooking fire, if you're lighting one. Another checks the food stores. The children, once roused, are sent to fetch water from the public fountain 2 blocks away. It's a task they hate, but have learned to accept, walking carefully with a heavy clay jug between them, trying not to spill. The morning air that comes through your window carries the particular smell of a Roman city. Wood smoke, yes, always wood smoke from thousands of cooking fires. But also human waste, because the streets serve as open sewers in many areas, and the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's famous sewer system, only handles so much. There's the smell of animals, pigs and chickens and dogs, and the occasional goat. There's rotting food from the previous day's market refuse. There's the sharp tang of urine, which is actually collected and sold to fullers, the people who clean and process wool cloth, because the ammonia in urine is excellent for that purpose. But there are good smells too. Baking bread from the nearest bakery, a smell that makes your mouth water and your empty stomach clench. Fresh herbs from someone's window garden. Flowers, surprisingly, because even in poverty, people sometimes plant beauty. Olive oil, that ubiquitous lubricant of Mediterranean life. Incense from a nearby temple. Wisps of sacred smoke joining the more profane varieties. You move to the window and look out. Your view is not spectacular, mostly the wall of the building across the narrow street. So close you could almost touch it if you leaned out. But you can see a slice of sky, pale blue, already promising heat for the day ahead. You can see people beginning to move in the street below, figures reduced to the tops of heads and shoulders by your elevated vantage. There's the water seller, already making his rounds, selling amphora after amphora to those too old or too busy to fetch their own. There's a fishmonger calling out his wares in a voice that's already hoarse from use. There's a group of slaves, marked by their tunics and the chains some of them wear, being led somewhere by an overseer. There's a litter, curtains closed, being carried by 4 strong men, presumably holding some aristocrat who needs to get somewhere but wouldn't dream of walking like the common people. The street itself is an obstacle course of animal droppings, discarded food, pottery shards, mud from where water was spilled, and other hazards best left unexamined. The paving stones, where visible, are worn smooth by centuries of traffic. There are no sidewalks in the way we'd think of them, just the shared space where pedestrians and animals and burden carriers all mix together in controlled chaos. You pull back from the window and turn your attention to more immediate concerns. Breakfast, such as it is, needs to be addressed. The grain allowance from the state, if you're entitled to it, needs to be protected and rationed carefully. The empire provides free or very cheap grain to male citizens of Rome, a policy dating back over a century to prevent riots when food prices spike. It's a monthly allowance, enough to make basic bread or porridge, not enough to thrive on, but enough to survive. You have to be registered, you have to be a citizen, and you have to be male. Women, children, slaves, non-citizens, they're expected to be someone else's responsibility. If you have your grain ration, you'll take it to the communal oven later, or to a mill to be ground into flour. For now, you might have some leftover bread from yesterday, hard enough to use as a weapon, but edible if dipped in water or cheap wine. Or maybe there's some porridge left, pulse, that thick gruel made from wheat or barley. That's the staple food of the Roman poor. It's not delicious, but it fills the stomach and provides enough energy to work. Your child returns, struggling with the water jug, sloshing liquid down their tunic. The water from the fountain is fresh, pulled from the aqueducts that feed Rome, and it's one of the genuine marvels of your existence that you have access to clean running water at all. In this, at least, Rome is ahead of its time. The engineering that brings water from mountain springs dozens of miles away, maintaining a gentle downhill gradient all the way, distributing it through a complex system of channels and pipes to hundreds of fountains, baths, and yes, even some private homes, is the sort of technical achievement that won't be matched again for over 1,000 years. But clean water at public fountains doesn't mean clean water by the time it reaches your cup. The jug itself, clay porous and possibly contaminated from previous use, may introduce its own problems. The fountain might be clean, but the area around it certainly isn't. Still, you drink because the alternative is dying of thirst, and your body needs water to function, needs it desperately in this Mediterranean climate, where summer heat can kill. The children are dressed now in their own small tunics, miniature versions of adult clothing. Your spouse has secured a small portion of bread and is breaking it into pieces, distributing it with the careful equity of someone who knows hunger intimately. You receive your portion and eat it slowly, making it last, chewing each bite thoroughly. There's no butter, no honey, maybe a smear of garum if you're fortunate, That fermented fish sauce that Romans use on everything despite its smell that could best be described as aggressively marine. Breakfast done, such as it was, you face the tasks of the morning. The chamber pot needs emptying, and today it's your turn. You pick it up, careful not to slosh the contents, and carry it down the narrow stairs, past neighbours also beginning their days, out to the street where you join the morning parade of people doing exactly the same thing. Some head to public latrines, those communal toilets where dozens of people sit side by side and use a shared sponge on a stick for wiping. Others simply pour their pots into the street gutters, adding to the general miasma that makes Roman streets both famous and infamous. You choose the public latrine 2 blocks away, because at least there the waste flows into the city's sewer system, where it will eventually reach the Tiber River and become someone else's problem downstream. The latrine is a simple structure, a long bench with holes cut in it at regular intervals, no privacy dividers, no doors. There are maybe a dozen people already sitting there when you arrive, conducting their business while chatting amiably with neighbours. Romans don't have the same hang-ups about bodily functions that later cultures will develop. The body does what it does, and there's no point being embarrassed about it. You empty your pot into one of the many openings, rinse it with water from the trough, and head back out into the strengthening daylight. The sun is fully up now, painting the buildings in shades of cream and honey. The street is busier, filling with people pursuing the 1,000 errands and activities that keep a city of 1,000,000 souls functioning. And you, dressed in your rumpled tunic, stomach still growling, slightly despite the bread, face yet another day of work in the greatest empire the world has ever known. The morning has barely begun, and already you're tired. But this is life as a regular person in ancient Rome, and it continues regardless of fatigue, regardless of circumstance, one foot in front of the other, one day after another, in the eternal present tense of survival. Now that you're awake, dressed, fed after a fashion, and slightly cleaner than you were, it's time to think about the rest of the day. The sun climbs higher, warming the narrow streets, and all around you, the city throbs with purposeful activity. Rome doesn't wait for anyone, and neither does your need to earn enough money to do this all again tomorrow. But first, let's understand what it means to be a working person in the Roman Empire at its height. The economy of Rome is vast and complex, a machine that runs on human labor and ingenuity, on trade goods flowing in from every corner of the known world, on agriculture that feeds millions, on industries both mundane and sophisticated. And like any economy, it creates winners and losers, though the game is rigged from the start. You're not winning, to be clear. You're surviving. If you're lucky, you have a trade. Maybe you're a baker, rising before dawn to prepare loaves in the communal oven, selling them to people who can't or won't bake their own. Maybe you're a coppersmith, a weaver, a cobbler, someone with skills that can be sold. These trades are often organized into collegia, the guilds or associations that provide mutual aid, set standards, offer some protection against the worst predations of the market. Your guild might help pay for your funeral when you die, might support your widow, might give you a sense of belonging in a city that's often indifferent to individual suffering. Or maybe you're a laborer selling your muscle by the day. You stand in the forum at dawn with hundreds of others, hoping a contractor or a wealthy landowner will hire you to haul bricks, dig ditches, build walls, load ships, work in warehouses. The pay is uncertain, the work is brutal, and there's always someone desperate enough to accept less than you need, driving wages down towards subsistence level. Or maybe you're a street vendor, selling anything from hot food to imported cloth to stolen goods. You need a permit, theoretically, but enforcement is spotty and bribes are negotiable. You set up your stall in some corner of the city where the aediles, the officials responsible for public order, haven't bothered to chase you off recently. You sell whatever you can get your hands on, making tiny margins on each transaction, hoping that volume will add up to enough to feed your family. Or maybe you work in one of Rome's many shops and workshops, the tabernae that line the ground floors of insula buildings. You might be a slave yourself, working for an owner who pockets all the profit. Or you might be a freedman, still owing obligations to the person who manumitted you, bound by legal and social ties that don't end when official slavery does. Or you might even be a free citizen, employed by someone slightly less poor than yourself, earning a wage that never quite stretches far enough. The working day starts early, sometimes before dawn, and continues until the work is done or the light fails, whichever comes first. There are no 8-hour shifts, no workers' rights, no minimum wage beyond what the market grudgingly provides. If you're injured on the job, that's your problem. If you're too sick to work, you don't get paid. If you complain too loudly about conditions, you'll be replaced by someone more compliant. Let's say you're a porter, someone who carries things. Rome has laws against wheeled traffic during daylight hours in the city centre, meant to reduce congestion and noise. This means that everything that needs to move, from food to building materials to household goods, must be carried by human hands or pack animals. It's back-breaking work, literally. You might carry an amphora of wine, weighing 30 or 40 pounds through streets that are crowded, uneven, slippery with things you don't want to think about. You might make dozens of trips in a day, your shoulders rubbed raw by carrying poles, your back screaming in protest. The pay for this work is perhaps a few sesterces per day, if you're good at negotiating and the employer is feeling generous. A sesterce is a small brass coin, one of the basic units of Roman currency. How much is it worth? That's complicated because prices fluctuate and vary by location. But let's try to ground it. A loaf of bread might cost half a sesterce. A jug of cheap wine may be the same. A visit to the public baths, admission costs a quadrans, which is a quarter of an aes, which is a quarter of a sesterce. So you're looking at something like 1/16 of a sesterce. Practically nothing, which is why the baths are so popular across all classes. But rent on your insular apartment, that's going to run you several hundred sesterces per year, maybe 30 or 40 per month depending on the neighbourhood and how many flights of stairs you're willing to climb. Clothing costs money, food beyond the grain dole costs money, shoes, when yours finally disintegrate, cost money. Medical care, if you're desperate enough to seek it, costs money. Everything costs money, and you never have quite enough of it. If you're in a better position, if you have a skill that's in demand, you might earn more. A skilled craftsman, a mason or a carpenter, might make 4 or 5 sesterces per day. A teacher, if you're educated enough to be one, might charge similar amounts, though many teachers are actually slaves or freedmen working for wealthy households, their compensation going to their owners. A doctor, almost certainly a Greek immigrant or freedman, because Romans traditionally looked down on medicine as beneath the dignity of proper citizens, might earn substantially more, though most physicians serve the wealthy and the poor make do with folk remedies and prayers. And then there are the truly lucrative occupations, though these are rarely available to people of your class. Tax collectors, who skim profits from the sums they gather. Merchants with capital to invest in shipments from Egypt or Syria or Spain. Gladiators, if they survive long enough, who can earn prize money and maybe even fame. Prostitutes, who exist across all price points, from the most expensive courtesans entertaining aristocrats to the cheapest streetwalkers serving soldiers and slaves. The workday involves danger in ways that would horrify a modern safety inspector. Construction work, common in a city that's constantly building and rebuilding, means scaffolding made of lashed poles, no safety harnesses, no hard hats. People fall, people die. If you're working in a warehouse, crushing injuries from loads shifted unexpectedly are common. If you're working near animals, kicks and bites are constant risks. If you're working near fire, and someone always is, because fire is how Romans heat homes, cook food, light darkness, and process materials, burns are inevitable. Industrial work is even worse. The tanneries, where animal hides are processed into leather, involve standing for hours in vats of urine and excrement, the smell so overpowering that tanneries are pushed to the edges of cities wherever possible. The fullers who clean and process wool cloth use similar chemicals. The potters, working with kilns heated to extreme temperatures, face heat exhaustion and burns. The miners, extracting iron and copper and gold from the earth, work in conditions that are essentially death sentences, especially if they're slaves or condemned criminals, which most miners are. Agriculture, if you're in the countryside rather than the city, is its own flavour of unrelenting labour. The vast latifundia, those enormous agricultural estates that feed Rome, are worked by teams of slaves under brutal overseers. Free farmers, small landholders, still exist, but are increasingly squeezed out by competition from slave labour and by debt that forces them to sell their land to wealthier neighbours. The rhythm of agricultural work follows the seasons in ways that urban work doesn't. Planting in spring, tending through summer, harvest in fall, relative rest in winter. But rest is relative when animals need daily care, when equipment needs maintenance, when the landlord expects his rent regardless of what the harvest yields. And harvest time, when it comes, is dawn to dusk madness. The entire family in the fields, racing against time and weather to bring in crops before they spoil or get eaten by pests. Slavery deserves special attention because it's so pervasive in Roman life. If you're a slave, your experience varies wildly based on who owns you and what work you're assigned. A household slave in a wealthy home might live comparatively well, eating the master's leftovers, sleeping in relatively comfortable quarters, receiving occasional gifts or bonuses. An educated slave, a Greek perhaps, working as a tutor or secretary, might be treated with a certain respect, their intellectual labor valued even as their person remains property. But most slaves don't have it so easy. Most are working in the fields, in the mines, in the workshops, at tasks that are repetitive, dangerous, and soul-crushing. They're fed enough to keep working, but not well. They're housed in barracks or shacks. They're beaten if they're slow, punished harshly if they resist. They can be sold at any time, separated from spouses and children, moved across the empire to wherever labor is needed. An enslaved person in Rome can, theoretically, earn or be granted manumission, freedom. This happens more than in some other slave societies, though it's still relatively uncommon. A slave who's saved enough money, earned through tips or side work, might buy their freedom. An owner might free slaves in their will, a gesture of generosity or perhaps guilt. Freedmen, once manumitted, become Roman citizens, though with some restrictions and continuing obligations to their former owners, who become their patrons. This patron-client system actually structures much of Roman social and economic life. A patron, someone wealthier and more powerful, provides protection, assistance, opportunities to clients, who in return offer support, labor, political backing. It's a reciprocal arrangement, though the reciprocity is weighted heavily toward the patron's benefit. As a poor Roman, you need a patron, someone who might hire you for work, who might speak on your behalf if you're in legal trouble, who might lend you money in an emergency. In return, you attend on your patron, appearing at their home in the morning to pay respects, supporting them politically, maybe doing small favors. The morning salutatio, this ritual attendance on one's patron, is a daily feature of Roman life for many. You wake early, put on your best tunic, which is still pretty shabby, and walk to your patron's house, a proper domus if they're wealthy enough. You wait with dozens of other clients in the atrium or outside the door until you're admitted. You greet the patron respectfully, receive perhaps a small gift of money or food, listen to instructions or requests, and then go about your day. It's humbling, this public display of dependence, but it's how the system works. Midday approaches, and if you've been working since dawn, you're exhausted. The sun is high and hot now, beating down on Roman streets that are designed for everything except shade. You're sweating through your tunic, your throat is dry, your stomach is demanding attention more insistently. Lunch, prandium, is usually a light meal, taken quickly so as not to interrupt the day's work too much. If you're on a work site or in a shop, you might just chew on some bread or a piece of cheese, wash it down with posca, that mixture of water and vinegar that soldiers drink. And that's the closest thing Rome has to a safe, portable beverage. If you're near the forum or a market, you might stop at one of the thermopolia, those Roman equivalent of fast food joints, small shops with counters where pots of stew or soup are kept warm and can be ladled out into bowls for a few coins. The food from a thermopolium might be a chickpea stew, heavy with garlic and herbs. Or maybe it's a fish soup made from whatever was starting to smell questionable in the market that morning. Or perhaps it's just more porridge, though fancied up with some olive oil and a sprinkling of salt. You eat standing or sitting on a nearby step, spooning the food into your mouth with a wooden spoon, or sopping it up with bread. It's hot, which is good. It fills your stomach, which is the main point. It probably contains some nutritional value, though that's honestly uncertain. The streets at midday are at their busiest. This is when the markets are in full swing, when the forums are packed with people conducting business, when the law courts are hearing cases, when the public fountains are crowded with people filling jugs and washing clothes and gossiping. The noise is tremendous, a wall of sound made of human voices and animal sounds, and the clatter of work being done. Street performers compete for attention and coins, jugglers and musicians and storytellers. Beggars work the crowds, some genuinely desperate, others operating as part of organized operations. You see the full spectrum of Roman society here, compressed into these public spaces. The wealthy pass in their litters or walk with entourages of slaves. They're easy to spot, the rich, by their clothing, fine togas rather than simple tunics, by their well-fed appearance, by the way they move through crowds that part automatically before them. The middle sort, successful merchants or freedmen who've done well, dress a bit better than you but not ostentatiously. They're trying to climb, these ones, accumulating wealth and status. And then there's everyone else, the plebeians and slaves, the vast majority, dressed in rough tunics, sun-darkened skin, bodies marked by labor and scarcity. Women are present in public spaces, which might surprise you if you only knew Roman society from its laws and aristocratic practices. Elite women are supposed to be sequestered, protected, their movements restricted. But working-class women can't afford such restrictions. They're in the markets buying food, at the fountains fetching water, working in shops or at trades. Some are slaves, obviously, sent on errands by owners. Others are freed women or freeborn citizens, doing what needs to be done to keep households functioning. Children are everywhere, playing in the streets despite the hazards, working as apprentices or assistants, begging, stealing when opportunity presents. Rome has a lot of orphans, given the high mortality rate, and the ones who don't have family to take them in must survive however they can. Some are picked up by slave traders, sold into whatever work buyers want them for, which isn't always something you'd want to think about. Others form into gangs, packs of feral children who know the city's every hiding place and opportunity. Rome is, in other words, crowded and chaotic, and sometimes cruel, but also vibrant and alive in ways that smaller towns never manage. There's an energy here, a sense of possibility mixed with danger, the feeling that anything could happen, for good or ill, around the next corner. After the midday meal, if you're following typical Roman patterns, comes the siesta. Not everyone can afford to stop working, of course. If you're a laborer being paid by the day, every hour counts. But the heat of the afternoon, especially in summer, makes outdoor work nearly unbearable, and many Romans, given the choice, will rest during the hottest hours, resuming activity when the sun drops a bit. If you're able to go home, you might lie down for an hour or two, not exactly sleeping, but resting in the dimness of your apartment, letting your body recover slightly before the afternoon's efforts. If you can't go home, you might find some shade, a colonnade, or the shadow of a public building, and doze sitting up, one eye always alert for thieves or officials who might move you along. The afternoon, once it resumes, tends to be devoted to the same sort of work as the morning, though energies are flagging now. This is when accidents happen, when attention slips, when mistakes get made. You push through because you must, because stopping means not earning, and not earning means not eating, and not eating means dying, eventually, though probably more slowly and miserably than you'd prefer. As the afternoon ages toward evening, there's a sense of anticipation building. The working day is almost done. Home, humble as it is, awaits. And before home, for many Romans, there's a daily ritual that's become so central to their lives that it's almost definitional of what it means to be Roman, as opposed to some barbarian from the provinces who doesn't understand civilization. It's time to go to the baths. The decision to visit the baths today is less a luxury than a necessity. You haven't bathed in 3 days, and even by Roman standards, which are honestly more tolerant of body odor than modern sensibilities, you're starting to offend. Your tunic smells of sweat and work. Your hair is oily. Your skin itches in places where dirt has accumulated in folds and crevices. You need to get clean, or at least closer to clean, and the baths offer the only practical way to do that. Rome is famous for its bathing culture. By the time you're living here in the 2nd century, the city boasts hundreds of bathhouses, ranging from small local facilities barely larger than a room, to the massive imperial thermae that can accommodate thousands of people at once. The baths of Trajan, completed just a few years back, are among the largest and most impressive. The baths of Caracalla, even more spectacular, won't be built for another century, but when they are, they'll occupy a space the size of several city blocks and include not just baths, but libraries, gardens, gyms, shops, and art galleries. But you're not going to the Grand Imperial Baths today. Those are on the other side of the city, and while admission is cheap, it's not free, and every coin matters. Instead, you head to the neighborhood balneum, a smaller establishment owned by some local entrepreneur who charges a quadrans, that quarter of an as we mentioned earlier, for entry. It's mid-afternoon, the time when many Romans visit the baths after the day's work, but while there's still enough light to make the trip worthwhile. The bathhouse is easy to spot, even in the maze of Roman streets. There's usually a sign, a painting or carving indicating its purpose, and there's always the sound of splashing water and echoing voices. The building itself is often quite nice, even if the neighborhood isn't. Bathhouse owners know they're competing for customers, so they invest in at least the appearance of cleanliness and comfort. You enter through a doorway that's wide enough to allow groups to pass, paying your tiny fee to an attendant who's seen thousands of bodies come through here and couldn't care less about yours. The apoditerium, the changing room, is crowded with niches where people store their clothes and sandals. There are supposed to be attendants watching the clothes, but theft is common enough that smart bathers only bring what they're willing to lose. You strip off your tunic, adding it to a pile in one of the niches, and wrap yourself in a small towel if you brought one, or simply proceed naked if you didn't. Roman attitudes toward nudity, at least in bath contexts, are pragmatic. Everyone has a body. Bodies are what they are. There's no point being embarrassed about the meat you walk around in. The bath complex is organized around the principle of progressive heating. You'll move through a series of rooms, each warmer than the last, then reverse the journey, shocking your system from hot to cold in a process Romans believe is essential to health. You start in the frigidarium, the cold room. It's not unheated exactly, but it's certainly not warm. There's usually a pool here, unheated water that's shockingly cold when you enter it. Some bathers start with a quick plunge, getting the cold shock over with. Others skip this step, planning to return to it after they've heated up elsewhere. From the frigidarium, you move to the tepidarium, the warm room. This is where many bathers spend the most time, because the temperature is comfortable, not extreme in either direction. The room is warmed by the hypocaust system, that brilliant Roman engineering that involves heating air in a furnace and circulating it through channels under the floor and within the walls. The heat rises through, warming the rooms above. Slaves, working in the furnace rooms, feed wood into the fires constantly, sweating in conditions that are far worse than anything the bathers experience. You sit on one of the heated benches in the tepidarium, feeling the warmth seep into your muscles, relaxing tensions that have built up over the day's labor. Around you, dozens of other people are doing the same. Conversation flows freely, gossip and business and politics all mixing together. The baths are social spaces, places where Romans of different classes mingle, though the truly wealthy often come at different hours to avoid the crowds. Next comes the caldarium, the hot room. This is heated even more intensely than the tepidarium, hot enough that the air feels thick and heavy, hard to breathe. There's a large basin of hot water here, and the room itself is steamy, moisture beading on the walls and ceiling. You're sweating immediately upon entering, which is the point. Romans believe sweating opens the pores and allows impurities to escape. They're not entirely wrong, though their understanding of how bodies work is limited by the medical knowledge of their time. You splash hot water on yourself, letting it run down your skin, loosening dirt and oil. Then comes the real cleaning, the ritual that's distinctly Roman. You take out your strigil, that curved bronze or iron blade, and you scrape your skin, dragging the tool down your arms, legs, torso, back, removing the mixture of oil, sweat, and grime that comes off in distressingly large quantities. If you're with a friend or family member, you help each other reach the difficult spots. If you're alone, you do your best, knowing you're missing some areas. Before entering the caldarium, many Romans apply olive oil to their skin, rubbing it in to help clean and moisturize. The oil, mixed with the day's accumulated dirt, is what the strigil removes. The resulting scraping, the mixture that comes off, is collected in basins and, oddly enough, sometimes sold. Some Romans believe the floor scrapings from baths, particularly from the baths used by gladiators, have medicinal properties. Whether this is true or just another folk belief is unclear, but there's a market for it. The process of bathing, this movement through the rooms, this cycle of heating and cooling takes time. An hour, maybe two if you're not rushed. It's a significant investment of time, which is why people do it in the afternoon after work, rather than starting the day with it. The baths are open from early afternoon until evening, sometimes later, and they're lit by oil lamps after dark for those who want to bathe at night. But the baths are more than just washing facilities. They're community centers, places where Romans gathered to exercise, socialize, conduct business, share news. Many bath complexes include palaestrae, those open courtyards where people can wrestle, box, lift weights, play ball games. The exercise is often as important as the bathing, another aspect of Roman belief in physical health as a component of overall wellness. The noise in a bathhouse is considerable, and it's not always pleasant. The Roman philosopher Seneca famously complained about living above a bathhouse, describing the cacophony, the grunts of weightlifters, the slap of masseurs' hands on flesh, the splashing of water, the shouts of vendors selling snacks and drinks, the squeals of people having their body hair plucked. Romans, both men and women, often removed body hair, a painful process involving tweezers, the general roar of hundreds of people talking at once in the echoing space. There are hazards too. The water is changed, but not frequently. Everyone is bathing in the same pools, which means you're sharing water with people who have various infections, skin conditions, open wounds. The warm, moist environment is perfect for spreading disease. And Romans, not understanding germ theory, don't take precautions beyond what seems common sense. If someone is obviously sick, they might be turned away. Otherwise, everyone shares the space and the water. After the hot room, you return to the tepidarium for a bit, letting your body adjust. Then finally to the frigidarium for a shock of cold water that closes your pores and invigorates your system, at least in theory. By the time you emerge, you're clean, or much cleaner anyway, your skin pink and glowing from the heat and scraping. You retrieve your tunic, hoping it's still there, and dress in the changing room. Many bathhouses have attached facilities, shops selling food and drink, for example. You might buy a snack, maybe some sausage or a pastry, something to quiet your stomach before heading home for the evening meal. Or you might save your coins and head home immediately, your stomach rumbling in protest, but your mind focused on stretching the day's earnings as far as possible. Walking home from the baths, you feel more human than you did this morning. The grime of the day is gone, at least temporarily. Your muscles are relaxed. There's a pleasant tiredness that comes from the heat and the exercise. The streets are beginning to empty as evening approaches. The quality of light is changing, the harsh afternoon glare softening into something golden and gentle. You pass through neighborhoods you know intimately, every building and street corner familiar. You nod to neighbors, exchange brief greetings. There's Lucius the cobbler, closing up his shop. There's that freedwoman who sells flowers, packing up her unsold blooms. There's a group of children playing some game involving a ball and stick, their shouts echoing off the walls. The city smells different in the evening. The cooking fires are being lit in countless homes, the smoke carrying the smell of frying onions, baking bread, whatever people have managed to acquire for dinner. The heat of the day is dissipating, though it's still warm, that Mediterranean warmth that makes evening the most pleasant time of day. You climb the stairs to your apartment, the wood creaking under your feet, and enter to find your family preparing the evening meal. The cena, dinner, is the main meal of the day, the time when families gather and eat together if they can afford to. For working Romans, it's often a simple affair. More porridge or some variation of bread and legumes, maybe a bit of cheese or some olives if money has been good lately. Tonight, though, there's a small piece of salted fish that your spouse managed to get cheaply at the market. The vendor selling it off at the end of the day before it could spoil further. It's not much, but it will add flavor to the evening's meal, and everyone's anticipating it with something approaching excitement. The meal is prepared on the small brazier, that portable cooking device that's the only source of heat in your apartment. It's a simple clay or metal bowl on legs, filled with hot coals. A pot sits on top, holding whatever's being cooked. The smoke rises straight up, or would if there were a proper chimney, but there isn't, so it just fills the room until some of it finds its way out the window. You sit on the floor to eat, using your fingers and a piece of bread to scoop food from the communal pot. There are no individual plates, no forks, no formality. The family eats together, talking about the day, sharing small pieces of news or gossip. It's one of the few times when you're all together, when the work and worry can be set aside for a little while. The food is hot and filling, which is the main thing. Is it delicious? By modern standards, probably not. It's under-seasoned, the ingredients are of questionable freshness, and there's no variety to speak of. But it's yours, earned by your labor, and it will keep you alive another day, which is ultimately what matters. After dinner, as darkness falls fully, there's not much to do. Oil lamps are expensive to keep burning. The olive oil they consume is better used for cooking or eating. So most families go to bed soon after the evening meal, lying down as darkness fills the room, the only light coming from the brazier's dying coals or whatever moonlight makes it through the window. Before sleep, though, there might be a bit of time for leisure. Not much, and not anything elaborate, but some moment of respite. Maybe someone tells a story, one of the old myths that everyone knows but never tires of hearing. Maybe there's a simple game, knucklebones or dice, played for entertainment rather than gambling. Maybe there's just conversation, quiet talk between spouses or parents with children. Or maybe there's just silence, exhaustion too complete for anything else. Your eyes close almost immediately. Your body, worn down by the day's labor and the heat of the baths, surrenders to sleep without resistance. Around you, your family settles into their own rest. The small sounds of people adjusting on sleeping mats, sighs and shifts and murmurs. Outside, the city continues. Rome doesn't sleep, not really. There are always people awake, working night shifts or engaging in activities that prefer darkness. The carts and wagons, banned during daylight, rumble through the streets now, making deliveries, moving goods. The drunks stumble home or don't. The night watch, such as it is, patrols looking for fires or criminals. The beggars find doorways to sleep in. The dogs bark at shadows. But inside your small room, high in an insula that leans just slightly more than seems safe, you're asleep. And for the next several hours, until dawn brings its own noise and responsibilities, you're free from the weight of being awake in the Roman Empire. And so, the day ends. Not with drama or significance, but with the quiet exhalation of another 24 hours survived. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same struggle to eat and work and maintain some small dignity in the face of systems that don't particularly care whether you exist or not. But tomorrow is not yet here. For now, there's sleep, deep and dreamless. The body recovering what it can before being asked to do it all again. Let's pause here, in this moment of rest, and consider what it all means. You've just lived a day in ancient Rome as a regular person, someone without power or wealth, someone trying to survive in the gaps between grandeur. And what have we learned? First, that daily life in the Roman Empire, for most people, was hard. Not in the way that adventures are hard, with drama and heroism. Hard in the way that poverty is hard, a grinding, relentless pressure that never entirely lets up. You worked constantly and never had quite enough. You were always one disaster away from catastrophe. You lived in buildings that could collapse or burn. You ate food that was nutritionally inadequate. You drank water that might be contaminated. You breathed air thick with smoke and pathogens. You had no safety net, no insurance, no welfare state beyond the grain dole, which was as much about preventing riots as helping people. Second, that despite all this, people found ways to live. They formed families, raised children, made friends, participated in religious rituals, enjoyed the baths, told stories, laughed at jokes, experienced joy in small moments. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, and Romans adapted to circumstances that would seem unbearable to us. They made lives worth living in conditions that were objectively terrible. Third, that the empire, for all its achievements, was built on the backs of regular people who received very little benefit from its grandeur. The aqueducts that still inspire awe. Wonderful, but only if you could reach the fountains and carry heavy water jugs back up 4 flights of stairs. The roads that connected the empire? Magnificent, but irrelevant if you never travelled further than a few blocks from where you were born. The Pax Romana that brought relative peace. Nice, but peace doesn't fill an empty stomach or cure disease. The Roman Empire, seen from the bottom up rather than the top down, looks very different from the traditional narrative of civilization and progress. It looks like survival, not triumph. It looks like endurance, not glory. And yet it functioned, this empire, for centuries. Millions of people like you lived these lives day after day, generation after generation, creating the surplus wealth and labor that allowed emperors to build monuments and generals to conquer provinces. The economy, which we've touched on but should understand more deeply, was sophisticated but deeply inequitable. At the top, enormous concentrations of wealth allowed the senatorial class to own vast estates, multiple properties, hundreds or thousands of slaves. They invested in trade, in agriculture, in anything that would generate more wealth. They lived in a different world from yours, a world of fine wines and elaborate dinners, of political intrigue and literary salons, of leisure and cultivation. In the middle, a smaller merchant class and successful freedmen accumulated enough to be comfortable. They could afford better housing, varied food, education for their children. They aspired to join the upper classes, and sometimes their children or grandchildren succeeded. though social mobility was limited and class barriers were real. And at the bottom, where you lived, survival was the primary achievement. You earned money irregularly, spent it immediately on necessities, saved nothing because there was nothing to save. Credit existed but was predatory. Debt could lead to slavery or bondage. You were free in name, but constrained by economic circumstances that kept you perpetually on the edge of disaster. The patron-client system, which we mentioned, was supposed to provide a safety net. Your patron was obligated to help you, and you were obligated to support them. In practice, this meant the wealthy received political backing and labor from their clients, while the clients received occasional gifts and the psychological benefit of being connected to power. It was better than nothing, but it institutionalized inequality, making dependence a virtue and independence nearly impossible. Religion, which permeated every aspect of Roman life, served multiple functions. It explained the inexplicable, providing reasons for why bad things happened. It gave structure to the year through festivals and holy days. It offered a sense of connection to something larger than individual struggle. And it reinforced social hierarchies, with priests drawn from wealthy classes, and religious office carrying prestige and power. The Roman pantheon was vast and syncretic, absorbing gods from conquered peoples and allowing for local variations. There were state gods, official deities, worshipped in grand temples with elaborate rituals. There were household gods, the lares and penates, that every family honored in their small shrines. There were specialty gods for every conceivable activity and concern. There were mystery religions imported from the East, offering personal salvation and secret knowledge to initiates. For you, as a regular Roman, religion was simultaneously deeply important and somewhat pragmatic. You honored the gods because it would be foolish not to, because angering divine powers seemed like a bad survival strategy. You participated in public festivals because everyone did, and because they offered rare moments of communal celebration, free food, and entertainment. You made small offerings at your household shrine because your ancestors had done so, and because tradition mattered even, especially when everything else was uncertain. But did you believe in the way we sometimes mean that word, with deep conviction and emotional commitment? Maybe. Or maybe your relationship with the divine was more transactional. I'll honor you, gods, if you'll protect me and mine. I'll make offerings, attend festivals, respect the sacred, and in return, I expect you to not let my building collapse, or my children die, or my next meal fail to materialize. The emperors themselves, starting with Augustus, were sometimes deified after death, becoming gods in their own right. This wasn't necessarily strange to Roman thinking. The line between human and divine was always somewhat permeable, and if the gods could take human form, why couldn't exceptional humans ascend to divinity? The imperial cult, worship of the emperor as a god or as a quasi-divine figure, served political purposes, creating loyalty and awe, but it was also just another part of the religious landscape. Health and medicine, which we should examine more carefully, were understood through frameworks that seem strange to us now, but made sense within Roman knowledge systems. The dominant medical theory was humoral, inherited from Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. The body, according to this theory, contained 4 humors, fluids that needed to be balanced for health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with different qualities and temperaments. Illness resulted from imbalance. Treatment aimed to restore balance through diet, exercise, bloodletting, purging, various drugs made from plants and minerals. Some of these treatments helped, purely by accident. Some did nothing. Some made things worse. Bloodletting, for example, the practice of deliberately removing blood from sick people, is almost always counterproductive, weakening patients who are already struggling. But Romans also understood some things correctly. They knew that clean water was important, hence the investment in aqueducts. They knew that waste needed to be removed from living areas, hence the sewers and public latrines. They knew that exercise and cleanliness contributed to health, hence the baths and the emphasis on physical fitness. They knew to quarantine people with obviously contagious diseases, though they didn't understand the mechanisms of contagion. Doctors were often Greek, either immigrants or slaves or freedmen, because Romans traditionally considered medicine beneath the dignity of proper Romans. The best physicians served the wealthy, attending them in their homes, prescribing treatments and supervising regimens. The military had its own medical corps, relatively sophisticated and effective, which is why soldiers tended to live longer than civilians. But for ordinary Romans, medical care was hit or miss. You might visit a doctor if you could afford one, but you were just as likely to rely on folk remedies, prayer, or simply toughing it out and hoping your body healed itself. Infant and child mortality were horrific, though Romans accepted them as normal. Perhaps 20 to 30% of babies died in their first year. Another significant portion died before reaching adulthood. If you survived to age 10, your life expectancy improved considerably. You might live to 40, 50, even occasionally older. But most people didn't live long lives by our standards, and old age, when it came with ailments that couldn't be treated beyond basic pain management. Dental care didn't exist beyond extractions. Vision problems couldn't be corrected. Broken bones sometimes healed and sometimes didn't. Infections killed regularly. Parasites were endemic, picked up from contaminated water or food. Tuberculosis was common. Malaria flourished in marshy areas around Rome, killing thousands every summer. Gastrointestinal diseases, diarrhea and dysentery were constant threats. And then there were the plagues, those periodic pandemics that swept through the empire, killing without discrimination. The Antonine Plague, which began around 165 CE during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, killed millions across the empire. It might have been smallpox or measles, diseases that Roman immune systems had never encountered. Whatever it was, it devastated the population and contributed to the beginning of the empire's long decline. Regular people faced all of this without modern medicine's tools. No antibiotics, no vaccines, no anesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. Surgery existed, but was crude and dangerous, reserved for desperate circumstances. You recovered from illness through sheer constitution and luck, or you didn't. Given all of this, you might wonder why people had children at all, knowing the likelihood that those children would die young or live hard lives. The answer is complex. Children were economic assets, contributing labor as soon as they were able. They were old age insurance, expected to care for parents who could no longer work. They were social and religious necessities, continuing family lines and honoring ancestors. And of course, contraception was unreliable, abortion was dangerous, and people had sex because humans always have, regardless of economic conditions or rational calculation. Family structure in Rome was patriarchal, with the oldest male, the paterfamilias, holding legal authority over everyone in the household. He could, in theory, sell family members into slavery, kill them, arrange marriages, make all major decisions. In practice, families functioned through negotiation and custom, and many fathers were probably neither tyrants nor saints, just people trying to manage households in difficult circumstances. Women had limited rights under Roman law. They couldn't hold public office, couldn't vote in assemblies, couldn't represent themselves in legal proceedings. Married women were theoretically under their husband's authority, though in practice, women from working classes had considerable autonomy because economic necessity demanded it. You couldn't afford to keep your wife sequestered if you needed her income from spinning wool or selling goods in the market. Women worked in all sorts of occupations. They were vendors, craftswomen, entertainers, prostitutes, midwives, wet nurses. Some managed shops or workshops, especially as widows continuing their husbands' businesses. Enslaved women did the same work as enslaved men, plus the additional vulnerability of sexual exploitation by owners who faced no legal consequences for rape or abuse. Education existed, but was far from universal. Wealthy families hired tutors, often Greek slaves or freedmen, to educate their children in literature, rhetoric, mathematics, philosophy. Boys were educated more extensively than girls, preparing them for public life. Girls from elite families received enough education to manage households and be cultured wives, but their learning ended there. For working-class children, education was sparse or non-existent. Some might attend a school for a few years, learning basic reading, writing, and arithmetic from a teacher who was barely educated himself, scraping by on small fees from parents. Many children learned trades through apprenticeship, watching and helping until they could do the work themselves. Entertainment for ordinary Romans came in forms both free and cheap. The public games, those famous gladiatorial combats and chariot races, were offered by wealthy individuals or the state as gifts to the people. Admission was often free, though you had to arrive early to secure a seat in the enormous amphitheatres and circuses. The spectacles were brutal, thousands of people watching men and animals kill each other, but they were also social events, opportunities to see and be seen, to participate in the collective experience of the crowd. Theatre was popular too, though not with the same status it held in Greek culture. Roman theatre tended toward comedy, mime, and spectacle rather than tragedy. Performances were loud and physical, designed to entertain crowds that included many illiterate people who needed visual storytelling. But most entertainment was informal. Conversation with neighbors, dice games and board games played in the streets, children's games that have existed forever, tag and ball and make-believe, music from street performers, stories told by firelight. The simple pleasure of being clean after a visit to the baths, a cup of wine shared with a friend, a festival day when no one had to work and there might be free food distributed. Let's talk about the physical city, the urban landscape you inhabited. Rome at its height was monumental. The Forum, actually multiple forums by this period, each associated with an emperor who built one to glorify his reign. Temples everywhere, dedicated to dozens of deities. The Colosseum, not yet called that, but officially the Flavian Amphitheatre, capable of seating 50,000 people and featuring elaborate mechanisms for raising animals and scenery from below the arena floor. Trajan's Market, a massive shopping complex with multiple levels of shops and offices. The imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill, sprawling complexes of luxury that gave us the word palace. But alongside all this grandeur, the mundane city continued. Narrow streets where donkeys and people competed for space. Open sewers carrying waste toward the Tiber. Garbage accumulating in corners because while there were sanitation workers, there were never enough of them. Graffiti on walls, ranging from political slogans to crude jokes to lovers' declarations. The remains of ancient buildings incorporated into new construction, Rome cannibalizing itself as it grew. The insulae, those apartment buildings where you lived, were often structurally unsound. Built with the cheapest materials, with minimal foundations, they had a tendency to lean, crack, and sometimes collapse. Fires were constant threats, because every apartment had open flames for cooking and lighting, because construction was largely wood and plaster, and because there was no effective firefighting force until Augustus created the vigiles, a combination police and fire department that was still underfunded and undersized for a city of 1 million people. When fire broke out, and it did regularly, the result was catastrophic. Entire city blocks could burn, thousands left homeless, dozens or hundreds dead from burns or smoke inhalation or building collapse. The vigiles would try to contain the fire, mostly by creating fire breaks, pulling down buildings in the fire's path to deny it fuel. The people trapped in upper floors of insulae had little chance of escape. The narrow stairs clogged with panicked neighbors, smoke filling the spaces faster than people could evacuate. And yet, despite all these hazards, life continued. The city rebuilt after fires. New insulae rose on the burned foundations of old ones. People moved in, paid rent, started the cycle again, because where else were they going to go? Rome was the economic heart of the empire, the place where opportunity, such as it was, concentrated. The countryside offered its own hardships, different but not necessarily better. The sheer density of Rome's population created problems that Romans solved with varying degrees of success. Water supply, which we've discussed, was genuinely impressive. The aqueducts brought millions of gallons daily from springs in the hills outside the city. The water was distributed through a network of channels and pipes to public fountains, baths, and some private homes. The engineering was sophisticated, maintaining gradients that allowed gravity to do all the work, designing settling tanks to remove sediment, building bridges and tunnels where topography demanded it. But water distribution favored the wealthy and the well-connected. Rich people in low-lying areas had private pipes bringing water directly to their homes. You, living in an upper floor of an insula, had to fetch water from a public fountain and carry it up multiple flights of stairs. The city's water was free, more or less, but accessing it required labor. Waste removal was less successful. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer, was ancient and effective, draining the forums and lower parts of the city. But much of the city wasn't connected to it. Waste from upper floor apartments either went into chamber pots that were dumped into the street or directly out windows onto passers-by below. There were laws against this, and supposedly people were supposed to shout warnings, but enforcement was lax, and accidents were common enough to be mentioned in legal texts. Public latrines, of which there were many scattered through the city, were communal spaces where dozens of people might sit side by side on benches with holes, their waste dropping into channels flushed by running water. These were social spaces as much as functional ones, places where Romans would chat while taking care of business, apparently unbothered by the lack of privacy. The communal sponge on a stick, kept in vinegar water and used for wiping, was shared among users, which is exactly as unsanitary as it sounds. The streets themselves were paved with large stone blocks, impressive engineering that created durable surfaces for heavy traffic. But the pavement didn't extend everywhere, and unpaved streets were muddy morasses when it rained, dusty swirls when dry. Stepping stones were placed at intersections to allow pedestrians to cross without wading through the mess in the street. Shop fronts opened directly onto sidewalks, or what passed for sidewalks, narrow strips where pedestrians walked when carts and pack animals and litters weren't blocking the way. At night, the city transformed. The cart ban lifted, and suddenly the streets filled with creaking wagons, their wheels loud on stone pavement, drivers shouting and cursing as they maneuvered through narrow passages. Sleep was difficult for anyone who lived on lower floors where street noise penetrated easily. You, on your fourth floor, were somewhat insulated by distance, though the sound of carts still reached you, a bass note underlying whatever other noises the night brought. Crime increased at night. Rome had no street lighting beyond whatever lamps individuals might carry. The narrow alleys and passages were pitch black, perfect for robbers and cutthroats. Smart Romans didn't go out alone after dark unless they had to, and those who did walked armed or hired guards. You, being neither wealthy enough for guards nor foolish enough for unnecessary night ventures, stayed home once darkness fell. But Rome was also beautiful in ways that might surprise you. Gardens existed throughout the city, private gardens in wealthy homes, public gardens attached to temples or forums. Trees lined some streets. Flowers grew in pots on balconies and windowsills. Fountains provided not just water, but aesthetic pleasure. The splash and glitter of falling water, sculpture and decoration adorning even utilitarian structures. The temples were magnificent, their marble columns and painted statues catching sunlight, their interiors dim and mysterious, smelling of incense and sacrifice. The forums were vast open spaces, paved and colonnaded, centers of public life where politicians gave speeches, lawyers argued cases, merchants conducted business, and ordinary people gathered to hear news and see who was who. Art was everywhere, not just in temples and forums, but in private homes and public baths. Mosaics decorated floors, intricate patterns made from thousands of tiny colored stones, frescoes covered walls depicting gods and heroes, landscapes and daily life. Sculpture ranged from colossal statues of emperors to small votives left at shrines. Romans loved visual splendor, and even relatively modest buildings might have decorative elements, painted plaster, molded reliefs, something to please the eye and demonstrate culture. Music was common too. Street performers played pipes and lyres, hoping for coins from passers-by. Festivals featured elaborate musical performances. Wealthy homes employed musicians for dinner parties. Even ordinary people sang while working, taught songs to children, hummed familiar melodies. The music wouldn't sound like anything we'd recognize, the scales and rhythms foreign to modern ears, but it filled the air with sound that was deliberate and meaningful. So Rome was simultaneously awful and amazing, a city of contrasts so stark they seem almost contradictory. Magnificent public buildings and squalid private housing, clean water and filthy streets, high culture and grinding poverty. It was possible to see the Colosseum and marvel at human achievement, while also living in an apartment that might collapse and kill you at any moment. This is perhaps the essential truth of Rome as experienced by regular people. The empire's greatness, its military might and engineering prowess and cultural achievements, existed alongside and often because of the suffering of millions. The marble temples were built by laborers paid barely enough to survive. The aqueducts were engineered by brilliant minds, but constructed by thousands of workers doing dangerous, exhausting tasks. The grain that fed the city came from vast estates worked by slaves in North Africa and Sicily. Every triumph of Roman civilization had a human cost, and that cost was usually paid by people like you. The anonymous, the uncounted, the ones who didn't get statues or mentions in history books. You were the foundation upon which the empire rested, and while emperors built monuments to themselves, they built almost nothing to honor or ease the lives of the people who made everything possible. And yet, you persisted. Generation after generation, people lived these lives, found whatever joy and meaning they could, raised children who would face the same struggles, died and were buried in graves that no longer exist or were never marked to begin with. The empire endured for centuries because millions of people like you kept working, kept living, kept trying to make something of existence, even when existence seemed determined to crush you. The 2nd century, the period we've been inhabiting, was genuinely Rome's high point. The Pax Romana, relative peace across the empire, allowed trade to flourish and prosperity to spread, though prosperity is always relative and uneven. The population was probably at or near its peak. Infrastructure was being built and maintained. The frontiers were mostly secure. The government, while never particularly democratic or just by our standards, was at least relatively stable and competent. But even at this peak, life for regular people was hard. The benefits of empire flowed upward to those who already had power and wealth. The lower classes received just enough to keep them alive and working, but not enough to escape the cycle of labor and scarcity. Social mobility existed in theory, but was rare in practice. Most people died in the same class they were born into, doing the same work their parents had done. The decline, when it came slowly at first. The Antonine Plague weakened the empire demographically and economically. The increasingly expensive military struggled to defend longer frontiers against more aggressive enemies. Inflation eroded the value of money. Political instability, the crisis of the 3rd century, brought civil wars and rapid turnover of emperors. The Western Empire eventually fell. The Eastern continued as Byzantium, but that's a story for another time. For you, living in the 2nd century, the decline is still far in the future. You don't know that the empire will fall, that the city will shrink to a fraction of its size, that the aqueducts will be cut, and the forums will be quarried for building materials, and the insula will crumble into ruins that archaeologists will excavate 2,000 years later. You only know today, tomorrow, maybe next week if you're a planner. You know that your stomach is full or empty, that your body aches or doesn't, that your children are alive or dead, that you have work or you're searching for it. The grand sweep of history, the rise and fall of empires, means nothing compared to the immediate reality of survival. And in that, you're not different from people in any age. We all live in the present tense, managing the circumstances we're given, trying to make the best of situations we didn't choose. The empires rise and fall, the monuments crumble, but the human experience of trying to get through the day persists across all times and places. So as we let you finally rest, as we close the door on this day in ancient Rome and return to our own time, carry this understanding with you. The Romans weren't mythical figures. They were people, as real as you, facing challenges that were different in specifics, but similar in emotional weight. They loved and feared, hoped and despaired, struggled and occasionally triumphed in small ways. The Roman Empire endures in ruins and texts, in languages derived from Latin, in laws and concepts that still shape our world. But it also endures in the recognition that human lives have always been complicated, that civilization is built on countless individual efforts, and that the unnamed and unnumbered matter as much as the emperors and generals who fill the history books. Sleep now, here in your comfortable present with its antibiotics and safety regulations, its food security and clean water delivered by pipes you never have to think about. Be grateful, not in a shallow way, but in a deep understanding that what you have is both historically rare and dependent on systems that function invisibly behind the scenes. And maybe, just maybe, use your advantages to make things better. To help those who are struggling now, in this time, to build systems that don't require such suffering from so many. To remember that behind every statistic and every historical period are individual humans just trying to make it through the day. The Roman Empire was magnificent and terrible, an achievement and a tragedy. The regular people who lived in it were neither heroes nor victims, but simply people, living the only lives they had, the only ways they could. And now, let them rest. Let yourself rest. The journey through time is over. Sleep well.